Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have you here. Today is a comprehensivist Wednesday, and my friend Joe is here along with me to talk about ignorance and questions. So what we're going to do is that this is going to be highly interactive meetup. So what we're going to do is that Joe is going to give a short presentation, maybe 5 minutes. I will talk for maybe 5 minutes about this issue of ignorance and questions. And then we will go into the breakout rooms and discuss this amongst ourselves. We're going to be talking about, basically we'll be asking about a couple of questions about ignorance and questions. That's it. And then after 20 minutes, we'll come back. And that's when most of the action is, where you get to share your takeaways and put any questions you have on the table. Folks, starting yesterday, I have decided one thing about the meetup, that I am requesting everybody to have writing material with you, okay? Pen and a paper is a very advanced technology, which came about very recently, only about a few thousand years ago. Like how many thousand years ago it was? About, I think, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, something like that. And it is the most powerful technology, okay? You may not believe me, but oh, there, great. I see lots of pens and papers. All right, it will make a big difference. I think this is going to be the best technological upgrade for this meetup. Forget about Zoom. We could do without Zoom, but we couldn't do without writing. So let's see what writing can do for us, okay? So use it to keep track of your questions, your thoughts. And then whenever you're speaking, look at what you have and speak on just the best thing that you have, okay? And I think the quality of the meetup is going to go up even more, all right? So just writing, and let's see what it can do. All right, so with that, Joe, go ahead.
Okay, welcome to 52 Living Ideas and Comprehensivist Wednesdays, and thank you all for joining us this evening. This evening we'll be discussing ignorance and how it drives science. For anyone that's unaware, Stuart Firestein is a professor at Columbia University, where he's chairman of the biology department, but he focuses on neuroscience. Now, there are two major themes in the TED Talk that he had given, and one is how we perceive science is conducted, and the second is how it is actually pursued. So Firestein believes that most of us have the false impression that science is this well-ordered, rules-based process. And we have the scientific method that we make an observation, we conduct a hypothesis, and conduct a test and consider the results. And these results provide us with a set of facts and have led to advancements in mathematics, physics, and any of the other sciences that we care about, essentially. But Firestein believes this is very, very different from how science is actually pursued. Now, scientific discovery, in his opinion, is not an orderly based process, but rather one that is filled with disorder and uncertainty. And he provides this analogy of it's like looking for a black cat in a dark room, and there may not even be a cat there. So what science is really all about, in his opinion, is how to deal with unknowns, and rather how to apply, not rather to apply the scientific method, but what really makes a good question is the way science makes its advances. So one of the reasons he had come to this conclusion was he was teaching grad school students and undergrad students. And while working with postdoctoral students and graduate students, they were making advancements in neuroscience and pursuing answers to the most challenging questions in neuroscience and really engaging with their imagination. And he found this to be an exciting and exhilarating to work this way. And essentially, he was able to see that the students were able to form good questions. They knew they were able to use their knowledge to basically cultivate their own personal ignorance. So this was a critical part of all the advancements in their lab. Now, he also worked with undergrad students, and he had a 1,400 page textbook. And I think he said it was 7.5 pounds. It's the size of 2 brains. But he spent an enormous amount of time putting lectures together. And I think he put together 28 or 30 lectures. And he was teaching students, and it was just an accumulation of facts that he was teaching students. And all they were doing is regurgitating facts at the end of the semester and taking a test. And he recognized, not only did he not feel that this was something that was interesting personally, he found that they were leaving the most important part of science out of the equation when they were teaching the undergrads. And that was the undone part of science. And this is what he's really calling is the thoughtful ignorance. So with that, he went on to actually set up a course, and he brought in professors from every department, and they would ask questions. They would give lectures on what they were working on, what they would like to know, what they think was critical to know, how might they go about in knowing it, and how it would be significant if the question were answered, and what would be the significance if the question didn't get answered. So that then students had a better understanding of what had yet to be discovered, and they had context to these facts that they were being taught. And this was really how they helped them essentially in forming a good question. Now, I'm going to try and relate it really briefly to a previous Comprehensivist Wednesday, maybe two Comprehensivist Wednesdays discussions. And the first one is the one with Russell Alcaroff. And he cited a study that was conducted by the National Institute of Health. And it was by a Johns Hopkins professor. And they took 60 students that were enrolling at Case Western University. And they were given a real world problem and broken into teams of 5. They quickly found out in order to solve this problem that they needed to know differential equations. And they didn't know differential equations. So they asked the professor, so are you going to teach us? And he said, no, I'm not going to teach you. I'll tell you where the resources are so that you can learn, and you can ask me as many questions as you would like. So by the end of the summer, each problem that the students had was solved. And it's not only that each problem was solved, all 95% of the students tested out of the first 2 years of mathematics in Case Western University. Now, why is that significant? Because they learned to deal with what they didn't know, and they were given a question. And so they were able to cultivate their ignorance so that they had an understanding of how to actually answer a problem. And these were real world problems. So it's kind of a validation of what Stuart Firestein's actually talking about here. The other one is the example of the Ooda Loop. The Ooda Loop is essentially, as we have discussed in the past, is just the scientific method. But what Boyd saw was that there was a problem in the scientific method with decision making and how to deal with unknowns and how to deal with chaos. So he implemented the orientation phase. And it's almost the process itself. The observe and phase is the same. Then there's the orientation phase. The decide phase is essentially the hypothesis phase. And the act is the same. Act phase is this same as considering the results. So these are two examples of how Firestein's theory actually plays out in the real world and is relevant and proven that his approach to teaching works. And with that, I'll leave it to Shrikant. You're muted, Shrikant.
Sorry about that, folks. Thanks, Joe. That was great. So I'm going to just simply talk about what points I got from the video. Essentially, and this point actually came up when Ruth Bernstein was here. The Ruth Bernsteins were here, and they were complaining that, you know, what is taught as science is actually not science. It is products of science. Science is all about figuring things out. It's all about asking questions. It is all about learning. And in giving people products of learning, you end up killing people's ability to learn. It destroys curiosity. Curiosity is the heart of science. Wanting to learn is what science is about. The process of learning, it's a process. The knowledge, what is called science, I don't know why that is called science. It's the result. But this process of science is what he's talking about. So you have to be focused on what we don't know. The real question is what remains to be done, not what has been done. Maxwell talks about thoroughly conscious ignorance. See, ignorance is kind of, it's like a loaded term. He deliberately uses to get your mind going. So that's really not what this is about. It's all about questioning. It is all about saying, yes, you know something, but what really matters is what are you doing? What remains to be done? Another way of saying is it's not about accumulation of facts. It's not about accumulation. That's just a result. It is about looking out and seeing what is there on the horizon, what is beyond whatever you already accomplished. George Bernard Shaw puts it very beautifully. It said, science is about generating more questions because you're kind of rising up in trying to understand the lay of the land. So you're actually able to see more and you're able to ask a more fundamental question. So it is the progression of questions. There is a kind of humility, which is epitomized by Newton. This is Newton at the end of his life, who was considered the greatest thinker ever. He says, I don't know how other people see me, but as for me, I seem to have been just like a kid, like a boy on a seashore who has found that some seashells are shinier than others. That's it. Whereas the entire ocean of details remains unknown. So that is the proper attitude of a scientist. The question is always not what you're looking at, but what can you ask about it? What is the most interesting? What is the most thoughtful question you can ask about it? It is kind of unsettling because subconsciously our system one yearns for certainty. Whereas to actually do science, actually to be curious in a genuine way, you have to be willing to live with ignorance for an indefinite period of time. He puts it as, it's not about filling buckets, it's about lighting fires. That's how he ends the talk. But to me, it is simply about process. It's primacy of process as opposed to product. Or another way, my favorite way of putting it is Louis Sullivan's term, it's about function, not about forms. The products, what people call science, are the forms that are produced by the function of curiosity, function of wanting to know, wanting to learn. So that's what science is about. So what we're going to do is, this is a very simple thing. I'm delighted that so many of you have watched that video. So I really like this format very much, that it was such an easy thing to watch and so profound thing to watch. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start up the breakout rooms. We will have about 20 minutes to discuss this amongst ourselves. I'm going to post the rules for the breakout rooms. The rules are very simple. First, let everybody give their take for about 1 to 2 minutes. And once everybody has had a chance to have their say, then you can go ahead and have a discussion. And the rules are keep on topic, be brief, be courteous, and encourage others to speak. And if needed, click on ask for help. Now, Joe is going to, we have come up with 2 questions that we would like to ask. Joe, go ahead. To discuss during the breakout rooms, but if you can come up with better questions, you are welcome to discuss them. So the 2 questions that we came up with is just look at yourself. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, in what areas are you better at embracing your ignorance, and in what areas are you worse? And how can we as individuals begin to cultivate our own thoughtful ignorance?
Very good. So, I mean, this is the best thing that we could come up with earlier. Now, with everything that we have said, maybe there is a better way of formulating the questions. The purpose of this question is to just look at yourself and to see what extent you are just relying on products and to what extent you are really engaging in the process of learning. And what is, and how can you do that better? That's what, these questions are about. All right, folks, so I'm going to start the breakout rooms. We'll be back here in 20 minutes. And then it's going to be I encourage everybody to share the takeaways. Again, reminding you of the great new technology that we are using from now on, and that's the writing technology. So write up observations that you have, and then speak of the best observations that you have. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, everybody. All right, so it's time for takeaways. Joe, are you back? Okay, Joe is back. Very good. All right, folks, so it's time for takeaways. What we're going to do is you can share your takeaways. You can ask a question, and we had a very short presentation deliberately so that we have plenty of time to talk about ignorance and questions. So as always, we have these 4 rules. Rule number 1, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. Rule number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about ignorance and questions. Rule number 3, be brief. And I encourage you to use writing. You don't have to speak out as soon as you think of things. Write down. You don't need to write it in full sentences, but write a point down, review it, and speak the best point that you have. And last, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. So we're going to start with Claudio. Claudio, you got your hand up first. So you first. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Okay, yes, the takeaway I got is I learned that ignorance does not have to be stigmatized, because there's 2 different types of ignorance. There's the higher ignorance and the lower. The higher ignorance is empowering. It allows you to progress scientifically, whatever you're doing, the truths you're trying to find out, and it doesn't stymie progress. The lower ignorance, it's more like being unenlightened, unaware, and according to the video, it's a different type of ignorance that can stymie you. It can stop you from moving forward. And you shouldn't be satisfied with facts like certainty, because that could also stymie progress. So that's what I like the most about the video. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And folks, feel free to talk about your comments about the video as well. All right, who would like to go next? Okay, it's going to be Nari, Elliot, and Judith next. Nari, go ahead.
Something interesting that came up in our discussion that Sanjay mentioned was that he looks at facts as probabilities. So like we're never 100% certain of something, and that what we know as the truth now may change in the future. I really like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that's the idea of kind of Bayesian thinking, where you always hold open the possibility that you may be wrong, and you are actively looking for things that would contradict with what you're saying, or what you're thinking. So that way it corrects your confirmation bias. Excellent. Sanjay has always amazing things to say. Next up is Iliad, Judith, and Laura. Iliad.
Yes, thank you. I think this has been really insightful. I noticed in our discussion that I think there was a large consensus that we're better at embracing our ignorance when we are alone, and it becomes harder and harder when we are together with other people, because you lose that sense of accountability in a way when there's a group mindset. And so it was interesting when we asked what we might do to cultivate our own thoughtful ignorance. The gut reaction was, well, maybe we should just be more alone and think, when we're by ourselves a little bit more. But what we realized when another member shared was that, going to these groups and talking and being vulnerable is a way to reflect on our own ignorance, and be vulnerable and admit our own gaps in knowledge, especially by coming to learn together. So that was really, I thought, a fascinating discussion.
Wonderful. I just want to make sure I got the first point right. So most of the people in the group were saying that it is easier to admit your own ignorance to yourself as opposed to other people?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's harder to admit your own ignorance when other people are.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But I want to say one thing about it. This is what I noticed about our meetups, because our meetups are like a third place. It's not a family. It's not a business. And what happens is that people are afraid of the consequences of looking as if they don't know things in the family or in the business setting. But it's a very odd thing. It's like it's strangers on one hand, but at the same time, these are all strangers committed to exploring and learning. So it is quite easy to learn how to do this in a group, in our group, because there is a culture for that. And then you can carry that to other contexts. So thank you very much, Iliad. Great observations. Next up is going to be Judith, Laura, and Maritza. Judith.
Yeah, so that was my small group there that Elliot was talking about. So I'm just going to throw out a different question that I always have anyway. And that is, how children can be educated. And it's not as easy as, it might seem. My daughter's a teacher, and if you have in a school system, 40 kids in the classroom, and then there's the structure of the school that's very regimented that the teachers have to live within that anyway. But even otherwise, even if they had full freedom, seems like you'd want to have kids feeling okay to express ignorance and ask questions. Would be the most important thing, would be to make kids feel interested to explore, and that questions are a good thing and not knowing is a good thing. And how that could be encouraged and how you could do that when you're, one-on-one, it might be easier with a child, homeschooling or something, but when you have a classroom setting, it's not as easy. And I'm curious about, what types of, I just think our education system has to evolve in some way. We have to find better ways. I think it's almost the most important thing we do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. And this idea of kind of, doing this within a social group, I think is a very interesting point. It keeps coming up because there is a lot of kind of social pressure that happens in the peer pressure of these kids. And a radical example in education is the Montessori system, which basically it's like a environment setup, and all these kids are individually doing their thing. And whenever they want to cooperate, they are cooperating. So it's instead of kind of sitting there being lectured to. So for me, the short answer is I think Montessori provides an excellent model for this. Next up is going to be Laura, Maritza, Becky, and Stephen. Laura.
Okay, I think that ignorance gives you a want for inquiry, and when you have that, you're searching for a way, a process to engage and to move on. And that's what I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Thanks.
Okay.
Next up is Maritza and Becky and Stephen. Maritza.
So a couple people mentioned it, and I wanted to bring up where it is that, community comes to mind for me when thinking about ignorance, and specifically the question asking about thoughtful ignorance, and how can we encourage and bring this about as an individual. But what comes to mind for me is that it's actually a contrapositive. The path towards increased thoughtful ignorance, as it were, in an individual, it has to start with the community. If we build a community where it is more acceptable to do things like this professor was saying, where you encourage the different questions, and you don't give them answers, you make them think out of the box. He says he says scientists, they're reaching for facts and reasons, but it is when they are most uncertain that the reaching is most often imaginative. And I don't think that the best way for us to attain that is actually done individually. I think if it's done within a community, then when we disperse and we are being individuals, we have bigger and better tools now to use individually, but we're going to grow those tools with the community. That's at least the way I see it.
Can I respond really quickly to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, I agree with that, because that's the example that the professor, when they did the study at Johns Hopkins, he created an environment where everybody had to ask a question and they all had to come back to him, so that all 60 students were not given the answers. So they were given it was a job, and they had an obligation to solve this problem. But once it becomes okay to ask questions, and you have this, kind of environment where you have resources as opposed to, just having, being taught, I think that you're a lot more comfortable with yourself and your own personal ignorance in that process. So I think that's a really important point, because the communal aspect of it, across 60 students, nobody had a problem. If you do it with too few, it may not work out the way you planned.
Wonderful. Excellent observation. I mean, for me, I'm a very big proponent of this. For the longest time, I would study on my own. And I'm fine studying on my own. Okay, I can do that for years without talking to people. I can very easily do that. That's not a problem. But what I found is that this is the whole reason I do these meetups, because I do meetups on things that I don't know about, that I'm trying to learn about. And here are the advantages I see in interacting with other people. Number one, in the process of explicating to other people what you're thinking, you're forced to make things objective. You can't take too many things for granted. All of that has to be spelled out. Of all your bases have to be spelled out. That's one. That itself, just the attempt to speak to another human being, puts you at a different, in a higher level of precision. It will raise a whole bunch of questions that you have not thought of just by saying that, okay, I have to explain this to someone. Second, we are all prone to biases within our own self. So though it may appear to you that you are asking questions, there are going to be areas that you're not asking questions about, and you will not even know that there are areas like that. But when you actually talk to other people, they will come at it from some different angle, even if they are not actually calling you out or asking you about that. If you're observant enough, if you're actually listening to the people, you'll say, oh, that's something I did not even think of. What is that? What do I think about that? So it's a way of filling out and compensating for your biases. And part of it is that we are also social creatures. So there is a tremendous value to be gained by engaging with people who think the same thing that you're exploring as being interesting, and that enthusiasm. So it's not just, it's kind of combination of exchange of knowledge. You can learn from other people too. Somebody would have seen something that you have not seen before. So it's going to raise a whole bunch of new questions. It's going to motivate you. Also creates accountability that, hey, you got to watch this video for 18 minutes about ignorance and question and come to the meetup to talk about this. So it creates, habits. So there are so many different ways in which individual and social work very well together. And at the same time, I think the individual quest is critically important. You have to ask yourself, what are the deepest questions for me? And pursue those, and then seek communities where you can actually find those answers. So it's not, the questions have to come from you, but I think interacting with the community, you get a lot. Sorry about being long-winded, but that's what I had to bring this up because it connects with our meetup. Next up is Becky. Becky, go ahead.
So my comment to cultivating thoughtful ignorance is being quick to listen rather than quick to speak. And that naturally comes to me as an introvert, but it's also the idea of all the new input that you're exposed to gets filtered in a way where it's like, is the new input aligned with what I understand? And if not, if there's a mismatch, then that's where the questions generate. Why is it? Am I missing something from my understanding and my framework, or perhaps that whole thing is just wrong? But then it's having that comfort to, as you guys said, to sit with your ignorance, to section that new input rather than just automatically dismissing it into something, into like this unknown, in case there is further along, like you get more input where it makes that that coherent with your own framework and it gets incorporated. So it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about being comfortable with your ignorance, is being quick to listen.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Jean, Maxine, and Brian. Jean.
Yeah, I think with a smaller group, people know each other and have this kind of trust will really help with this expose your ignorance, because they have this architecture group. They have a bigger group and have a smaller group. And when we have the meeting with smaller group, they said they're not asked certain questions with a bigger group because they don't want to show how much they don't know. So it's kind of interesting. They feel more comfortable to have smaller group where they can more openly discuss their questions, because they don't want other people to see they don't know some basic questions they ask. I think a small group with more trust and also the environment of encouragement will give us the opportunity to explore our ignorance more openly.
Yeah, no, that's a great thing, but I don't think it has to do with small and large. I think it has to do with commonality of values. There are small groups where you wouldn't want to do that, and there are kind of big groups where the commonality of value of kind of exploration and stuff. I think so. It has to do with commonality of values, as far as I can see. Next up is going to be Maxine, Brian, and Kevin. Maxine.
Okay. I started coming to these lectures to stave off dementia. So I did not wish to go to anything that I knew about. So my field is music, and I stayed away from all musical things and went to, but when you go into an environment that you are unfamiliar with, you lose your confidence, and it is very intimidating. You feel like you're torturing the rest of the people around you. So how can you ask questions of them? Would it be better just to sit back and listen to answer your questions rather than ask them and have them give you hostile answers, which I don't really feel is very helpful to learning about the topic. Now, after you are involved in the topic for a while, I think that you possibly could ask the question, but in order to get away from the ignorant part of it, what is the best way to approach it?
Okay, this is a fantastic question. And what we are going to do is that I'm collecting themes. And so at the end, we'll come to, and I definitely want to address it because this is a question of, how do you enter a field? And what is the proper approach to questions when you're beginning a field? What is the proper and just way of interacting with other people with differences of knowledge? So all of that is really fascinating questions. So we'll take that. So one of the questions is about kind of the social pressure, social and individual. And second is this one, but a great question. We'll come to it. Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by Kevin. Brian?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, the phrase that came to mind was "ignorance is bliss," and depends how you interpret it. It can well be. The way I was thinking, ignorance of certain types of knowledge is where I make conscious decisions about areas that I don't want to know. An example: politics. I don't want to know anything about it, so I'm very ignorant in that area. I admit that, I'm happy about that, and I don't want to change that. I mean, you can have a selection of things where you're consciously ignorant of, as I do, but even so, that still leaves a wide base of things you can look at. The other thing I'd just like to add was on questions. A lot of people find it difficult to formulate questions. I think that's something that maybe should give some attention to. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be, I'm going to change the order slightly. It's going to be Shirley, followed by Kevin. Shirley, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, just a thought. To gain knowledge is power, and it's power for yourself mostly, which then enables you to embrace your ignorance, which then enables you to have awareness, which then enables you to be curious and have the ability to brainstorm, which then enables a reduction of ignorance.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Shirley. You're using
welcome.
high tech. You're using high tech. You're right. You've written something and you're reading it out. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. High tech, Shirley. Next up is going to be Kevin, Rourke, and Brian Nelson. Kevin.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to use yesterday you joined that's a diagram, right? Circle. That's very useful.
Mm-hmm.
If you simulate the draw one circle, that's your knowledge you know. That's the inside is what you think you know, perception.
Mm-hmm.
That's also people on audience who will reach that watch that video. The gentleman draw one diagram, let's say. Y-axis, what do you know? From nothing to everything. The X, the axis just how much do you know about it? It's from little or lot. In the beginning, maybe you draw one small circle, you see you know it. Then you thought it's perception, you know a lot. And then slowly you learn more. Your circle you think bigger. Outside the circle is entropy or ignorance or chaotic, you know, even bigger. So that's the same cycle. It's like here. When you learn more, you see it's more you unknown. But here in reality, is we focus inside what we know. We can control ourselves, self-future, self-image. We can do everything inside the circle. lastly, consider outside. Here's a question. Seems like Marissa said, we possibly need a formula. One is called ignorance community. You start learning formula question, answer it is then start from then question again. What's the next come up? Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. This point about inside and outside is very, very profound point. Boyd calls it, it's like an open system versus closed system. Moment you start thinking of whatever you think is a closed system, then you're finished, because it starts to have mismatches with reality. And every time you see a mismatch, you are actually evading it and you're running back to your own system. But when you regard it as an open system where you go and say, okay, based on my thing, this is what I expect to see, and you're very carefully observing outside mismatches between the reality and your own conceptions, it gives you the feedback, the observation base to correct, to rework your inside based on the outside. So that is a great point.
A quick follow-up is also the code fixed mindset and goal mindset.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Rourke, Brian Nelson, and Sharon and Mark. Rourke.
Hey, so what Maritza said really got me on a wild ride in my head, so I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible. She mentioned something about community responsibility. As we are social creatures, I think we tend to align our values with the values of our immediate communities. So typically what people value is probably or possibly what the people they're surrounded with value as well. Since our society has like a very large obsession with like monetary value and everything, it got me thinking about this study. I don't recall where or who did this study, but it was this. They had two separate kindergarten classes where they asked the children to draw art. And in one of the classes, the children were just rewarded with praise. And then the other class, the children were rewarded with like treats or whatever they found physically valuable, like materialistically valuable. And it turned out that out of both classes, the children that weren't rewarded with those materialistic values actually were more likely to pursue art as a passion. So I sort of wanted to suggest the idea of like the reason there are some of these very high-paying jobs that require intense knowledge or intense problem-solving capabilities, and this sort of stigma of people gravitating towards wanting or needing to have just more money, if that can potentially dissuade people indirectly from wanting to pursue these careers, like it contradictorily.
So thank you, Rourke. I'm going to continue with Brian. Let me see. Brian, you're next.
I didn't totally understand Rourke's comment, so I apologize there not to follow up on that. But on Kevin's comment and Shrikant's, that really anticipated what I was thinking, and that is that if we have ignorance, we have questions. The answers to questions are always tentative. That's my conclusion. It's that's true in science and in life. For example, I don't want to overburden this, but Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, says basically that all answers in science are tentative. You never really prove anything. You're only waiting for it to be disproven. And in life too, yes, answers are tentative, so we can discuss in our groups. And I like what Maritza said. I think that's really valuable to have a supportive community where mistakes and failures are permitted and embraced. But it's also true, as is illustrated by the Ooda Loop and also by science and very often in my own life, that, hey, you can't just discuss, you have to go out and do things. And you put things at risk and you make commitments, and there's life is really at stake. And you are still ignorant. You are acting in the face of ignorance. And guess what? You know, you're not going to get it right all the time. You just learn more. So cultivating thoughtful ignorance, yeah, you keep your mind open even as you're acting.
Okay, that's a fantastic point. I think that's a very fundamental point, because like lots of philosophy is focused, whenever they think about knowledge, they just think, or even science, they think of it as being completely inside your head. But action is a critical component. We are living beings, you know, we act, we get knowledge in order to act. So that feedback from actual action is critical part of keeping us grounded. And so that's a huge point. So thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Katie, Sharon, and Mark. Katie.
Hey, yeah, sorry, thought my video was on. Yeah, I had a lot of ideas. I know I was speaking in the comments, but I guess I'll just start here. So the idea of ignorance, I find really interesting, because I've had a very profound experience, like realizing an ignorance within myself. For example, when I was younger, I dismissed religion completely, and I was like, like, you know, it's a method to control people and blah, 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 blah. And like, I was very depressed. Like I had like, you know, I had suicidal thoughts since like the time I was 9 up to like, you know, almost 30. And I was very like, like I cut myself. I had anorexia. I dealt with a lot of issues basically. And I got to this point where I was very like so numb, but it almost started when somebody kind of initiated, like they noticed something was up basically. And I looked back into things like religion, and it was actually, I'm a very science analytical person. So that is why one religion was a turnoff. But when I did compare, it was actually Carl Jung, Tesla, George Gurdjieff, and Helena Blavatsky, that really, I would say I would contribute to this like weird awakening that I had that all brought shit together, where it was like, oh, like these ideologies like are not to be taken so literally. It's more of a philosophical thought that like they only were putting words into text of the vocabulary of that day. Like they didn't have the words that we have in modern times. And so like if you're looking at the Bible literally, like for example, you would say Jesus spoke in parables. He's speaking parables because he's teaching a lesson, and it's not to say like they take these like things literally, basically. Not to say that everything is taken for literal truth. It's like there's lessons to be derived from that, and that's like where I was ignorant in that whole thing. And like I see that a lot today, where people are totally dismissive of like all religion, like all religion's bad, like they're like and now like I love studying all religions. Like they all have a lot of great like insight that like if you actually really like dig down and try to drive the meaning out of the text, like it's so insightful. And like it created like I had a spiritual awakening from like science, and like literally had this overwhelming sense of ecstasy. And like I can explain it, but like I literally had this instant moment, and I never had a suicidal thought again. Like it was the craziest experience of my life. And like that's why yeah, don't be ignorant. Or like if you recognize that you are ignorant or something that you have dismissed in the past, like take a second look and like look at it again, because like it might actually, I feel like sometimes like it's a reflection of yourself if it's something that you're dismissing, like, you know, it's something that you're uncomfortable with, or that like, or that you don't like. Even if you meet a person and you hate them, like, you know, you see something about yourself reflected, and like, you know, you hate that person. So
thank you.
Just say, yeah. I had profound experiences.
Thank you, Katie. So I would say, I mean, people like, for example, Carl Jung or Jordan Peterson. So one of the things that they do is that they look back at what people have done in the past, whether it be kind of at our evolutionary stage or at kind of early civilizations. And they see that, you know, for example, myths and religions were trying to get at the same thing. And what they do is that they do what is called comparative mythology or comparative religion, where you stay, look across people and say, what are the themes that keep coming up? And those themes will keep coming up first in kind of stories, then in religions, and then in philosophy, and then in science. And you can see that their methods are different, and they are kind of more primitive methods, more kind of emotional, kind of gestalt kind of methods, but they're trying to do the same thing. And to be able to kind of span across history and understand people in their own terms, I think gives you a much deeper understanding of the human experience. Thank you, Katie. Next up is Sharon, followed by Mark. Sharon.
Yes, hi. This is my first time here and first time in this type of discussion group, so it's sort of interesting.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So I wrote things down, but I can't read my writing, so that's going to be a problem. I have my paper, but I have to say that I think it was one of the Bryans talked about politics. That was one of the things that he would not look at. And I have to say that I was, I used to stay away from politics. And right now I'm feeling that there's a pull towards that because I think everything's become politicized and I can't understand why people can't discuss things. And it's become this almost intractable thing. And I was just thinking that this idea of the ignorance is, if that could be something that we as a society or groups really think is a good idea, that would be very helpful. It's almost the opposite of indoctrination to me. And what I'm looking for is just like, I don't think I can ignore it anymore. I'm just feeling this because I just think it's so dangerous where we're going right now. And like even science is politicized and it shouldn't be, you know, so I'm feeling that and I'm looking for just a way that it makes sense to me. So I have a lot of questions or whatever. And even the format of something like this, where you have set it up where you would talk without interruption. So it's the opposite of a debate. There's no debate. It's people talking and maybe taking a piece of something somebody else is saying and going, oh, that makes me think of this in a positive way. And I'm just excited to be, you know, learning this in this way. And I don't know that I would have if it wasn't this type of format. And I have to figure out where I want to go with that from here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. So firstly, welcome. I've been doing these meetups in New York for the past 5 years. Many of the folks here have been there for several years, but many, like I would say 80% are new from other places other than New York. The thing that really distinguishes this is that it's a kind of a community for exploration. What happens in politics, not just politics, it happens in religion, it happens in groups of people, it happens in, you know, just across families. There is a tendency of holding on to a set of ideas and then regarding everybody who does not hold those ideas to be not us, something like that. So it's a question of, you know, people kind of creating these closed systems. It is the spirit of exploration, which is the antidote to that. And it's from all sides, you know, each person has to have that. And that is really, I think, the solution to all kinds of kind of narrow-mindedness. Because narrow-mindedness, by definition, what they're doing is that they're looking at some things. And they may be completely valid in what they are looking at, but they are just looking at those things and not other things. So many times it's like an elephant, you know, human beings are enormously complex. People latch on to some parts of it and then just hold on to just that. So I think that is the phenomenon. And the solution is basically exactly what we're talking about: questioning, curiosity, exploration. And those are antidotes to things at every level, at the epistemological level, at a psychological level, at social level, at political level, across the board. Thank you, Sharon. Next up is going to be Mark. Mark, go ahead. Mark, followed by, I don't know who it is yet. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, I just came in late and I get the gist of the discussion. So it brings to mind a famous quote that I remember my father taught me when I was a kid. which goes like this. It goes, he who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool, shun him. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep, wake him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not is ignorant, teach him. He who knows and knows that he knows is wise, follow him. So I think there's a lot of truth to that quote. And I think, like, and I study philosophy, and I think Socrates was really famous because he said he knew because he knew that he knew not. But, you know, my critique of philosophy of Socrates is that I think it's very important to also know what you know. And that depending upon how critical your thinking is, a lot of people, if they don't really think critically, they'll read some philosophy and that will be their new belief system. But there's no question that there are certain things that we know. And there's really anybody who thinks critically wouldn't debate that. Like, we know there is awareness, but there are other types of experience, things that we have hypotheses or conceptual knowledge. And that can evolve, and even if it does, it could still be relevant. Like Newton's theory of gravity, and those relationships still hold, even though you have the the relativistic model. It's not like it's been discounted completely. It holds within a certain domain. So, but I think that there's an interesting thing about real knowledge, and I think if you have concepts that are broad and deep enough, that then you can be right most of the time. Because if your concepts are broad and deep enough, then they'll encompass everything else. The thing is, they might not be that specific. They can't be that detailed, but they give you some basic guidelines. I think that basically most knowledge, like empirical knowledge, is really dealing with. We start off with our intuitions, and we have awareness, and we have certain intuitive experiences. That we can know. We experience imagination, our senses, but then we try to come up with, we want to understand the relationships and events that take place. But the problem with scientific thinking and with ultimate knowledge is that if you try to explain things, which is what science does, is referring one set of relations to another set of relations, it ends up becoming circular, or you have an infinite regress. So ultimately, the difference between spiritual thought and scientific thought is, I think most people have it backwards. They don't understand that the spiritual thought is really on a deeper level, and the notion is opposite. The reason is this: science likes to critique spirituality and says that they always have this excuse. They always have the God concept to explain everything. But the truth is that science has this hubris that there is that they'll ultimately have that there can be an explanation. But I think that logic would tell you, not spirituality and not science, logic would tell you that there are certain things that are without reason and that can never be explained. So the principle of sufficient reason doesn't hold for why there's being and or not being. However, the basic, let me just finish this basic thing. The thing is that science seems to think that you can keep explaining everything. Religions understand that there is no ultimate explanation, and the word that they have for no ultimate explanation is God. It's that being that has no cause that you have to ultimately refer everything to, some form of being that is uncaused. And so it can't fit into a scientific paradigm, but you can intuit it and you can reason to that being.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. So we'll see if I have time, we'll look at kind of spiritual and scientific if we have time. Okay. So I'll put that as a point. Thank you, Mark. I knew that you always have interesting things to say. So great. Next up is Sanjay, followed by Stephen. Sanjay.
Yes, thank you. So I'm hearing a lot of ideas here, and I just wanted to add some to this. So I think there are people who are looking at this as if science is talking about the need for having ignorance everywhere, or that ignorance is a good thing always. And I need to clarify this, because while ignorance is always there, and first of all, let me say this: that this is the subject we're talking about is not really specific to science. This is about knowledge in general. This is about gaining knowledge, and science is a process of gaining knowledge. It's actually not even a field if you think about it, because the process we use in science we use in every other field. So when we're trying to learn something, we know that there's a lot that we don't know. We know so much that we don't know, but at the same time, there are things that we do know. It's not that ignorance is wonderful. Ignorance is actually a negative aspect of our existence. You know, when we don't know something, we don't have abilities. So that's the reason why we want to remove ignorance. But the reason why scientists say, or philosophy in general, we say that ignorance is there is because even when you remove ignorance, ignorance is like a vacuum. It fills in and you can't get rid of it. So that's the reality of why ignorance is there. It's not that it's a good thing. Another point I wanted to make is that so science is a process that's iterative. It's an iterative refinement of knowledge. And what that means is that when that you do learn things in science, and you do, and again, not just science, you do learn things when you're learning, you know, of any area of knowledge. And after you've learned it, it's not that when you learn something new, the original version of what you learned gets replaced. That's not what happens. What actually happens is that when you learn something new, it refines what you knew earlier. It adds to it. It doesn't replace it. That's very important to understand. So what that means is that it's not that what you learned earlier was incorrect. It's that it was less correct. And what you've learned now is more correct. So it's always moving in a direction of improving precision and accuracy in your knowledge. That's the process of knowledge attainment. You know, some people call that science. The last thing I wanted to mention is that advanced areas of science is actually very statistical. And so for some areas where we can do a lot of experiments, hundreds and thousands of experiments, we actually are able to refine that level of knowledge to such a high degree of precision that it almost becomes incontrovertible fact. Now, scientists will never say that it is a fact because, again, I mean, everybody understands this part, that we won't know 100% anything. But that doesn't mean that having a 99.99999% certainty is not close enough to 100%. It's close enough that, you know, now we're able to create rockets that contain a robot which, you know, navigates through the solar system, slingshotting itself through planets, right? Landing on another planet, or even orbiting a planet, you know, then moving on to a second planet, then landing on a planet. I mean, this is the level of sophistication that we've gained, the level of knowledge that we've gained, which allows us to do very precise things, and you know, in every area of our being. So it's not that we don't know things, and it's not that it's bad to know things. We know a lot of things, but each time we learn something, it opens up, just like, you know, I mentioned science, ignorance is like a vacuum. It opens up an area that we realize now we can go into and learn more about.
Sanjay, wonderfully put. I fully agree. I mean, another way of thinking about it, the way in which I think about it, is to bring in action, because what we're doing is that we use all the knowledge that we have in order to guide our action. If we know something 99.9%, that's good enough for action. But at the same time, you are always observant about the results of the action. So if you see some mismatches, you are taking that on board in trying to do the correction. And knowledge is critical because knowledge is what is enabling us to make kind of this pro-life action. The way in which, I like the way in which John Boyd puts it, you know, you're trying to increase your capacity for independent action, and you're trying to build up knowledge that matches up with reality as best as you can, and then acting as well as you can on it, and then observing what happens. And if you see something which is a mismatch, then you readjust your things. Again, as your scale of action keeps on increasing, new domains come into, just like as you know more things come into view. As your capacity of action improves, you have further ability of refinement of actions. Another side of it is, I like Sapolsky. I think Sapolsky uses this term all the time, of having strong opinions weakly held. You need strong opinions and which guide your action. And then it's weakly held in the sense that you're always open to any evidence to the contrary. Next up is going to be two Stevens. So Stephen Hemrick and Stephen Bertoli. Stephen, go ahead. What happened? Okay, one of the Stevens dropped out. So the other Stephen.
Okay, I'm the second one, Bertolini. I have a few comments of different degrees of seriousness.
Go ahead.
The fundamental one is I actually do think it's impossible to do this alone. There's so much you don't know that you're not aware of that you really do need input that you don't already have. And in that respect, yeah, it does feel like it's a method that's possible to adapt to different situations. You know, in some cases, yes, your feedback is going to be very clear. If you're trying to fix your plumbing or your wiring, you'll get a good idea of whether it's doing what you want or not. When you do get into the extended comments on religion and things like that, yeah, you'll have strong opinions, but I would say it's still a good idea to let go of certainty since it is hard to tell. Third one, I think I'll just stick. You commented on the high tech and pencil and paper. And I did see a cartoon a few years ago that had the computer graphics lab, and you know how they have the case in case of emergency break glass. And so, yes, the computer graphics lab had the pencil and paper in case of emergency.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, the flexibility of this, you know, especially with the pencil, you can rub it. You can do the visual things. You can write. You can, you know, just all kinds of things. You can put it in small things. You can hold all of it. It's just incredible technology, and it just transformed the world. It's created civilization. That's a lot saying for technology. Next up is Evanik and JS. Evanik.
Yeah, I just was listening and I just had a couple of thoughts. So the first thing is about religion and science. I look at those two as being very similar. They're both ways of answering questions about the unknown. I think they can become similar, and that if you believe in God, you can believe that God is the creator, and science explains God's creation. So I thought of that, and I thought of like people trying to understand God's creation, and they look to the sciences to do that. So I think they can actually kind of go hand in hand, but I don't think that they're necessarily opposed. And then going to the subject of ignorance, I think ignorance really does lead to discovery, and that when people don't know the answer, they seek out the answer. And that's where I think ignorance is a great thing. I don't think ignorance is either good or bad. I just think I look at it as a tool. And, you know, some people can choose to stay in their ignorance for various reasons. Or people can choose to discover new things and not hold on to it and understand that it's something they don't know. If they want to know, they choose to discover it. And that's how we come up with advancements and developments and things of that nature as of today. So those were my two main takeaways so far.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is going to be JS, followed by Mike. Folks, there are lots of messages, so I might have missed some. So if I have missed some, just go ahead and type exclamation mark again. And we're just going to do one round. Anybody who has not spoken, I'm going to give a chance to speak now. And then we will look at some general themes that come out of everything that has been said so far. Okay, JS, followed by Mike. JS.
Unfortunately, I think that a lot of society puts a higher value on being right than seeking truth. And I think that being right and not making a mistake, they kind of get a bad rap. And I think intuitively we've known that. That's why we have things like there's no such thing as a dumb question. But it's almost like seeking the truth open-mindedly in an aberrated way is discouraged by our society. I really enjoyed the power of questions, the power of writing, and I got a whole new appreciation for Shrikant, the put a question and a takeaway out there, because the question is feeding the water, feeding the plant, and nourishing it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Julie. Really appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think if people walk away with questions, that's actually the most valuable thing. And questions, I mean, it's a question. That's one of the things I want to talk about. What's a good question? Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes.
I'm not sure that's adequate, but you'll cut me off when I hit the
Go ahead.
180 seconds. There's an analogy, synchrony between Plato's cave, the Matrix, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the rise and fall of the British Empire, the singularity, and what's going on today. And that has to do with knowledge and ignorance. And they said the comment is that it all goes back to whatever you want it to go back to. It all goes back to money, and money is a fiction. Civilization is a fiction. So we learned from Julian Jaynes that even consciousness is a hallucination, and when there's something called the singularity, and about 2/3 of you guys know what the singularity is all about. But the Roman Empire economy was growing at 30% per year, and 90% of the world's scientific research and economy was driven by Rome. And with the economy growing at 30% per year, all of the Goldman Sachs equivalents were looked like geniuses until the collapse occurred. And then
Mike, you're going way off topic though. Go ahead.
No, I'm telling you what the difference between ignorance and genius is an illusion.
Go ahead.
Or a hallucination. So what's ended up happening is that the parallels between all of those things, Plato's cave and the decline and fall of the British Empire. Britain was the reserve currency of the world, and now it's not. So Britain even got kicked out of India, right? No. So the statement is we're repeating. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes. And what looks like ignorance in one society in the Bronze Age was genius. When at the caveman,
okay.
And and we're similarly there right now. And I didn't use my 2 minutes yet, but I'll end at this point.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, folks. So I want to ask 2 or 3 things. I want to look at 3 themes that have come out so far. One of the themes is a question that I had, which I was trying to define. So I was wondering whether people had good answers for it. The second one is I want to look at briefly about the question about social and individual. I think, but we have looked at it pretty well. And then I want to look at Maxine's question. So the question I want to start out with is the question about what is a good question? What is a good question? We're talking about we should come up with thoughtful questions. What are the characteristics of a good question? So this is the lightning round. Okay, so you can provide your answers as briefly as you can. Okay, if you want, you can take a minute to think. You can jot down bullet points or words for you to talk about. So the question is, what is a good question? Joe, what's a good question?
Just a couple of quick thoughts. A good question is related to your purpose, and it's essential to the goal of what you're trying to answer. And I think that that's where we're talking about with things like Ooda Loop. What are the goal? What's the goal? And then kind of understanding that we get away from that. I think it also encourages a higher level of thinking, in that it spurs more questions than it does in us provide a certain. In other words, there isn't just an answer to it. It spurs more thought. So those are three quick,
Excellent.
off the top of my head.
Thank you, Joe. So it's going to be Linda followed by Mark. Linda, what's a good question?
A good question details what is already known and asks where that knowledge can lead. And that's my definition.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. Mark, what's a good question? Mark, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Yeah, I think like a good question is a question that when you ask it and then you come to an answer for it, it expands your mind and you have a certain experience of kind of like enlightenment, or a connection gets made and you see the world differently than you saw it before, in a drastic, radically different way. And that I think also the best questions ultimately don't really lead. They always leave the fact that there are certain things that are beyond knowledge and that are ultimately mysteries and that are beyond reason. And then any question that finishes that that it would come to the conclusion that there's a reason for everything is not really a good question, because the logic would suggest, once you really reason things through, that there are certain things that can't be answered. So to always have that in the back of your mind.
Thank you. Next up is Judith. Judith, what's a good question?
I think a good question is one that inspires you to go and find an answer, to learn more about it. You're just personally. So there's no bad question if it sends you out to look for answers.
Thank you. Next up is Becky. Becky, what's a good question?
What is the best method to learn what I want to learn? Do I go wide or do I go deep?
Thank you. Maxine, what's a good question?
A good question leads to another question.
Very nice. Thank you. Next up is, let's see, Jeff. Jeff, what's a good question?
One is, what's the most important thing that we're trying to achieve? And another would be, what can we learn from our experience?
Thank you. All right. So that was first question. Now let's take the second question, the one that Maxine brought up. So Maxine was saying, okay, and this is a very interesting topic. What she's saying is that, okay, I'm entering a new field, and now I very much, identify with that, because I do that all the time. I'm trying to learn new things. So the question is, what do you do about questions here? How do you proceed? What questions do you ask yourself in a new field? What questions can you ask others? Is it fair to ask them basic questions? Are you imposing on them? How do you proceed? How do you ask questions when you are entering a new field? What are the strategies for asking questions when you are entering a new field, both for yourself and with others? Linda, how do you ask questions when you enter a new field?
I think as you're entering a new field, it's your responsibility to learn some of the basic facts before you ask any questions.
Okay. You're talking about asking questions of other people, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. Evanique, how do you enter a new field?
The question I would ask myself is, what do I want to learn about that new field? And from there, that's when you ask other people the question about what you want to learn. So then that way you get knowledge for yourself. I do agree with Linda when she said you do get some basic knowledge, but then you ask questions on that basic knowledge that you don't know after you've done a little bit of work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is Joe, followed by Maritza. Joe, how do you enter a new field?
I think that it is, I'll just voice what everybody else has said and get a basic understanding. But the second most important part is to understand the perspective of the person you're asking the question to. You have to understand how they approach problems, because then you can ask them something that they may not have thought of. And then so you're learning what they think of, but then you can also tell them something they don't know. And I think that that's kind of critical, because then it really kind of starts to lead to a different discussion. So it's learning the opposite of what they know. So it's like,
that's a great point.
Yeah, it's like, tell me something I don't know. That's the most important thing, and you can do that with a basic understanding.
Wonderful. Great point, Joe. Really like that. Maritza.
I would say, how do you enter a new field? Ask a million questions, but ask them of yourself. I like Shrikant's idea of the pencil. In fact, I'm a huge fan of pencil. And you say pen. I use pencil, not pen.
Yeah, no, I too use pencil. Yeah.
But write them down. Like a million, every question that comes to mind in the new field, write them down. And I do that, pages and pages, and ask them of yourself. Even if you write down 100 questions and you yourself can only answer one, now you have 100 questions, and you can pick the ones that seem most enticing to ask of someone else. And then if it's written down, you don't overwhelm them by asking them a bunch of questions. You just ask them the one that jumps out of the page that just says, pick me first. And so that would be my suggestion.
Wonderful. And writing is just an indispensable medium for organizing your questions. You have all those questions, and then immediately you start to see hierarchy between them, what depends on what is more fundamental. Because otherwise, if you just deal with one question, you really do not know where that question fits in. It's only by putting it down on paper. So it allows you to be reflective, to self-reflection about your own questions, and organize your questions. And you can kind of start to see the structure of the field. Thank you, Maritza. Great point. Next up is Mike. Mike, 30 seconds on how do you ask questions in a new field?
In this time, I don't need even 1 second.
Beautiful.
Big question. Why and all its variants? Why? Why do you need to know this? Why are you here? Why is this important?
Wonderful. Why? Great. That was the briefest thing you have said, and the most powerful thing. I tell you, Mike, the less time I give you, the more you produce. There is a pattern here. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Becky. Kevin.
Hey, we are polymath, right? Use your polymath skills, everything connected. What's the transport skills you can use for the new field? The question is build your question map from they learn from known to unknown.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kevin. Becky, how do you ask questions when you're entering a new field?
Without fear of appearing as a fool.
Wonderful. Very well put. Next up is going to be Sanjay. Sanjay, what about you?
So I wanted to third what Linda said. I think it's very important, but I want to add to that, that it is our responsibility to learn as much as we can of the basics of a field before when we enter it. But after we've done that, many times people, they don't understand that they may have mislearned, or they may not have learned exactly what the basic concepts are. So I think it's very important to find someone that you can ask questions of to test whether you've learned things correctly or whether you've learned the correct basic information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sanjay. Mark, what questions do you ask when you are entering a new field?
Well, I think most all why questions are really forms of what questions, because the ultimate why question has no answer, because once you get the ground of being, there's no reason for the ground of being. But the only thing you can have an answer to are the relationships that exist. So anytime you're going to you're in any field, you want to expand, deepen, and broaden the knowledge of relations between phenomena, and those appear to be why questions, because usually what we do is we'll say, why is this like this? But then when we come up with the answer, we'll refer it to some other series of relationships or things that are. So they say, well, these things are predicated upon these things. So really all you're doing is specifying a relation. So
Thank you.
that's a what answer. And it appears to be the answer to a why. And you could say it in that convention it is, but the ultimate why question, there's no answer.
Thank you. Next up is Candice. Candice, go ahead.
So in a strange way, I actually don't ask questions when I first approach a new field. I listen. And I listen, and then when I feel like I've garnered and collected enough little bits of information, then I then proceed with my question. So in a funny way, it's kind of like Linda, where I'm collecting my information ahead of time. So I listen, and then I ask my questions.
Thank you. I mean, I like to enter new fields all the time. And one of the things is it's kind of equivalent to what Kevin said. Basically, I have kind of a lot of knowledge of things around that field, so I can triangulate from there. I ask many more questions to myself than anybody else, but by the time I'm ready to ask questions to other people, usually they tend to be very simple questions. And a person who really knows a field, it's kind of coming out of the left field because it is coming from outside the context of the field, a question about their field. So though it's a very basic question, they generally appreciate it a great deal because it is coming from a different angle than they normally think about. So it's kind of like combining with Joe's point that you have to give them something. It's a trade. All conversations are trade. You're trying to learn something and they are trying to learn something and you're helping them. So anytime I'm trying to ask people questions about their field, I'm usually trying to make sure that they are also leaving with something that they did not have before. So that's my take on it. So let's take the last question, and that was the toughest question. This is about questions. Is it an individual quest? Is it a social quest? And what is the relationship between the individual quest for asking questions and the social component of it? So how does asking questions individually and socially connect to each other? Mark, if you can say it very briefly, go ahead.
Right. So I think it's just a question of how you're approaching it. But ultimately, I don't think you can really disentangle them from each other. Because if you ask a very relevant or deep question about the self, it's going to have universal implications and it'll be new knowledge. If it's really deep, it'll probably be enlightening for everybody else, even though it was a personal. And if you ask a social question that's very deep or broad, it'll probably be applicable to yourself too.
Wonderfully put. Thank you. Next up is Evanique.
Mark stole my answer. I was saying it's intertangled. It's both. Like I said, if it's I always say if you have the question, that means other people have the same question, and you be brave enough to answer it. So yeah, it might be for your knowledge, but then it offers not only to the person answering the question, but also to other people who are listening in your social circle. That way they can get the answer that maybe they had a question about.
Wonderful. Does anybody else want to chime in on this? Individual and social. What is the relationship? What is the how do you do it? Anybody? Judith.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like what Joe was saying. It's like when you ask a question, it goes two ways. You might ask a question that the other person's never thought of, but that they find somehow applicable. And then they have other insights and they see things from a different perspective. So then you both grow and learn from the questions. So I think it's always useful to share questions with others, and it's a win-win.
Wonderful. So it's going to be Joe, Maritza, Jeff, Sanjay, and Maxine. Joe.
I'm going to answer with a question. I mean, so could you just clarify a little bit with the individual and social as far as it being in a structured setting? Like, so comparing what Maritza said earlier and what I believe, I forget the gentleman's name who spoke first as an individual. He spoke about the idea of being an individual. Is that what you're referring to?
What I'm saying is that, we talked about, today we talked about asking questions, importance of asking questions. So what is the relationship between you as an individual asking questions to yourself and you asking questions of other people? So like, how do you connect, how much of the learning is yours? How much of it is through your interaction with other people, and what is the relationship between these two?
Okay. I think it goes back to my previous answer then. I mean, with the idea of understanding what they know and then thinking the opposite and asking them a question. And that's the individual that because you get a lot of feedback from that, because you also find out what the other individual doesn't know in that process. That's yeah. So
thanks, Joe. Next up is Maritza, Jeff, Sanjay, and Kevin. Maritza.
I believe it's a symbiotic relationship. Like, how do they connect? Like that's how I would say that's, we have, all the questions there should be guided, but not leading, and then open, but with direction. And I think it's a push-pull as to whether it's the individual or the community that's doing the guiding or the leading versus the pushing and the pulling. So I think it's kind of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like the term of push and pull. It's like you are doing something, at the same time you're getting some kind of a reaction. And you need both of them because it provides a much more robust system. And it provides kind of a multiple level of feedback and correction mechanisms.
What came to mind to me was, the child game, like a saw.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Jeff, Sanjay, Maxine, and Kevin. Jeff.
So on the individual versus social, I think that there's a big difference between whether we are individuals and going to remain individuals, and we're exploring something just to learn more about it and see what kind of knowledge or information we might be able to contribute, or if we're in this together in some way and we need to make a decision about what we are going to do. There really is a we here moving forward in some way interdependent. And so for example, in this conversation, we're just learning from each other and we stay as individuals. If we were a team, we would need to know things like, well, what's the most important thing we're trying to achieve, and what might we learn from our experience of whatever we've tried so far? So I think that those begin to get at the differences between individual and social.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Next up is going to be Sanjay, Maxine, and Kevin. Sanjay.
Yeah, so when you asked this question, I actually thought of I thought you were asking a different question. And so when you explained it to Joe, I understood better. So I'll try to answer this question that you asked. When we're asking ourselves something, when we're asking a question for ourselves, it's to learn and to understand. But at the same time, when we do that, through our interaction with the other person or with broader society, we're actually reinterpreting, we're allowing them to reinterpret that same topic. So in a sense, we're expanding not only our own knowledge, but we're expanding their broader knowledge also. So there's always growth by asking questions. It's always growth in ourselves and in others.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Next up is Maxine and Kevin. Maxine?
Okay, so I still haven't gotten my question answered. What do you do about the hostility that occurs when you try to break into a new area of questioning that you perhaps would like to do? And I understand it. I really understand it, because when I go to meetups where I know everything, it's very boring, because you look at the other people and you think, oh, brother, what are we doing here? I mean, and you don't want to go back because it's, anyway, there is no growth. But when then you go to an area you know nothing about, and the people, I'm sure, look at me in the same way that I look at the other meetup group. So how do you get around the hostility of it so that you can ask the questions?
Okay, I think so. We'll come back to that. Let me have just Kevin say this, and then I think Joe had interesting things to say about this. So I'll have Joe respond to it, because it's a question of kind of making sure that you're giving something to the people that you're talking to, because it's always a trade. So there are many ways of doing that. But Joe, you want to take that first? You're on mute.
I think, it really it depends on the circumstance too. What type of environment are you going into? If it's a work environment and you're trying to discern as many answers as quickly as you possibly can, you're not only trying to get an answer to a question, but you're also trying to understand the other person's perspective. So that's a kind of a different approach. Whereas if in a new environment, I would say you have a basic understanding, you ask the questions, you can't have any fear about asking any questions. And, you have to live with the consequences, because I think there's a degree of perseverance that comes in, and courage, when you're breaking into a new area. So I think that there's two ways to look at this. It's one, you're very prepared, where you're trying to get the understanding of the entire whatever organization or group or who you're dealing with. But then there's the other part where you're going into a new area, you don't know anybody, and I think you're asking questions as best possibly can, and you have to live with the consequences if somebody doesn't think a lot of the question itself. I mean, that would be my thought.
And I would add just one thing. I'm saying that meetups, especially Zoom meetups, is a very artificial context. This is a very unusual context. So you shouldn't use that as a context to evaluate this basic question. The basic question would be in people that people whom you're actually dealing face to face with. And so that there is a feedback mechanism that you have. Because normally what happens is that in a group like a Zoom meetup, a lot of the context is already established. Everybody is very careful about their time. And you kind of have to respect that, and you have to figure out how to operate. So it's a completely different issue than just asking questions. And primarily, if you want to do something like that, then a lot of the responsibility is yours in order to prepare enough before you go into something like that. So that's what I would say. So the next one is going to be Kevin, Fika, and Claudio, I think. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, I would say use Google. Search the keyword, multiple click, compare the what you get. Then let's think about your questions. Compare the self, ask yourself others. It's about a validation process. It's internal, external. Question myself first, then elaborate the question to others to get a deeper understanding and share a mutual understanding. And actually, the question about the soul, the 5W1H, right? Let's see what's the topic. How do you work on it from on the roadmap? Then eventually it would be great. You know why it's work like that, and get your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Fika. Fika, go ahead.
Hi, in answer to the lady, one of the best things that I found myself to be very helpful is when you enter a situation that you think that you know everything about the topic, forget about your knowledge. Just put a new hat on and sit as you know nothing. There's a lot of things that we learn from people. We learn not from what is said, but we learn from untold. So listen to it in a different way. Don't listen to the words that are being said, but listen beyond those. I think that is a better way to learn.
Wonderful. So folks, I think this meetup has been very, very successful. I really like the format of this meetup. So let me tell you what the characteristics of this meetup was, and then you tell me what your comments are. You can comment in the chat if you want, or you can give us a feedback, in person. So what are the characteristics of this meetup? So number one is that we had a very short video, just 18-minute video that was easy for people to watch. And I was delighted to see just the sheer number of people who had watched it. What that does is that it creates this common knowledge, common thing that we all know what we are talking about, as opposed to something which is like a book or a new presentation. All of those have tremendous value. Okay, don't mistake me on that. Those are extremely valuable for learning new things. But this is a very unusual kind of a meetup where something that we are discussing is very easy for people to take in. Could be a very short article or a short video. It's very high quality video. Okay, I mean, it's raising a very deep point and doing it really, really well. So a well-selected short video. That was first point. Second is that Joe and I did not talk much. Okay, we were very quick. We just talked about what the video was. So we put it down on the table for anybody who had not watched the video, and it kind of refreshed the memory of everybody who had watched the video. Okay. Then we just went into the breakout rooms to have a discussion, right? Then we came back. Each person got plenty of time to kind of talk about their takeaways and pose the questions. We went through that entire sequence, and then we chose like 3 themes at the end to talk about it. So the interactivity was actually a lot more than what we normally do. And all of it was thanks to the fact that we had a short video in the end. So how did you think this meetup went? You can go ahead and say on scale of 4 to be great and 1 to be bad. So 4 is excellent, 3 is good, 2 is okay, and 1 is poor. So go ahead and type a number. Give us a grade, please. Okay, we got a 4, Joe. We got 1 4. Okay, we got quite a few 4s. Okay, it's good. So we'll do this again, folks, and we'll see you soon. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have all of you folks here, and I just love the level of conversation. And Joe, this worked out really well. I told you it will work out well.
Thank you, Shrikant. It worked out well. I'm very happy with it, and thank you. It worked out well because of you.
Well, you did a good job. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Take care.